Hi folks, we are going to talk logo stuff today. Let's roll. All right, there's some terminology that we need to know right out the gate. A lot of people talk about logos casually using all kinds of different vocabulary, but there are a few that we need to make sure that we are all clear on. So there are a lot of ways to describe the different parts of a logo, and there are more specific terms than this, but we are going to talk about four overarching categories. And when it comes to branding and creating visual branding elements, most packages include variations of one or more of these. So a lot of companies visualize themselves in a combination of these marks, not just one. So number one, we've got word mark. Number two, we've got brand mark. Number three, letter mark. And number four, a logo lockup or a combination. So let's look at each of these. Number one, word mark, also called a logo type. These logos are where the name of the company is really at the forefront and is being visualized in often a custom typographic treatment, but something that is type heavy. Here we've got a number of examples, right? This kind of an approach is really good when the name of the is good because the name of the company is really front and center. That can be particularly helpful for smaller companies that don't have a lot of brand recognition. Also, the name of the company can present some really nice visual capabilities, or it can be difficult to work with. So if you have a cool name, like I would argue Volvo is pretty memorable. It's got VOVO and then an L in the middle, so it's got like really nice forms to work with. Vimeo is a fun name, right? Disney is a fun name. So if you have a word that is fun or that just has interesting letter forms to work with, a word mark can be a great choice. But then, similarly, other names can be really challenging to do in word marks because maybe the name is really long, like Bethel University or College of St. Catherine's or, any number of words, or like boring, like Johnson, or I don't know, something like that. So one of the first things that I do when it comes to developing logos is I look at the word of the company I'm working with and just want to figure out right away if there are any fun visual things there that have potential within the name itself. Even looking at FedEx, right? The F and the E they're like very similar visually. So that's really nice that both of those words lead with that. There's a lot of possibilities then to design around, right? We already talked about Volvo. So anyway, that's your first starting point, is like look into the word itself, see if it has anything fun. Even if it has like Netflix is nice because it has 7 letters, so you have this kind of opportunity to play with symmetry where you've got three, and then one makes like the center, right? So things like that also can be helpful and give you kind of these visual nuggets that you can build upon. The second kind of logo that there could be is a brand mark, or sometimes called symbols. Symbol is a little bit of a misleading name because actually if we look into sort of the semiotic understanding of what symbols are, there are different categories of symbols. So we've talked about this in some other classes, but symbols can be a symbol, which traditionally means something that has no visual sort of representation or connection to the object that it is standing for. So Target would definitely, well, I guess Target does look like a target. An apple does look like an apple. Nike is definitely a symbol that is kind of a made-up mark that doesn't have a connection. It doesn't visually represent the object that's being communicated. McDonald's M is a symbol. Pepsi's Pepsi sign is a symbol. Right, Mitsubishi, also a symbol. But we can also use graphic elements that are what we would call icons or indexes, and those are images that either look like the thing that they're representing, which is what an icon is. So the apple looks like an apple, the target looks like a target. Or an index is something where and this is kind of more than you need to know for now, but a graphic that suggests the presence of something else, if that makes sense. So actually Twitter is kind of an index. They chose to use the bird to have it represent kind of like people chattering, right? Like this sort of bird song, like tweet, 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 okay? So the bird is a stand-in for the tweet, which is what Twitter is all about, right? Which is kind of interesting. So anyway, but essentially your takeaway here is that a brand mark or a symbol logo is a graphic. Big companies can leverage brand recognition with just a simple graphic. So if you're Target and your logo is really recognizable, or Pepsi, you don't even need to include your name anymore, which is kind of nice. Brand marks are nice because they're small and compact, so a lot of times that gives you a lot of opportunities with design. You don't have to like make room for a big visual element, like a big long name. And the association or connection between the brand mark and the company is learned. So it's you it's hard to be a young business or a small business and have only a brand mark, because you need to build that brand recognition so that people recognize what it is and know instinctually that it is the thing that it stands for. So a lot of times word marks are really helpful for a smaller or lesser known company, right? Because it just puts the name right there. So that's just one of the challenges of a brand mark, is it can be harder to use, or oftentimes if you're a smaller company, you might have a brand mark, but you're going to use it a lot or have really specific rules about when it's used with the word mark or when it's used separate from it, so that you're always making sure that you, at the end of the day, your audience really needs to know what they're seeing, right? What is the name of that company? What's the name of it so I can look it up on a website or go visit it or whatever, right? So just a really powerful brand mark is not always going to work for smaller situations. All right, the last category is a letter mark. And this is a typographic design that deals with initials only. So pros and cons to this: it can be helpful for companies and institutions that have really long names. Hewlett Packard coming down to HP, or British Broadcasting Channel, right? Those are it's nice to be able to, even General Electric, those are two really long words. So being able to condense those things down can definitely be helpful. It kind of splits the difference between a word mark and a brand mark by just using a few letters. So you get kind of the brand recognition that a word mark gives you, but you get the kind of smaller, more graphic, condensed graphic style that you would have with a brand mark. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds. It also works really good with some companies that have memorable acronyms, or even more memorable acronyms than what their name is, right? Like OXO is really lovely visually. I don't even know what that stands for, but those visuals are really nice, and it's kind of a memorable collection of letters. ESPN goes really well together, right? Much better than the longer version of it. So pros and cons to working with letter marks. The fourth category, which is kind of a catch-all and is a little bit complicated in some ways, but we would call these logo lockup or a combination logo. And a combination logo is a formal presentation of word marks and brand marks combined. Most companies have this. I would say this is probably the most common version, and then they may have options within their branding to separate the two. So separate the word mark from the brand mark and use them independently in certain situations. Some brands may have exclusively combination logos, like Bethel University never really separates, while other logo systems may include separate word marks and brand mark options, which is what I just mentioned. This is commonly used, these combination logos are commonly used for external communication, since they include both the brand mark and the word mark, and that creates the most brand recognition. So again, it's all about brand recognition here. You want people to look at your graphic and immediately know the company, and so an easy way to do that is to always kind of use both, right? Like the name of the company and the logo. So here's some great examples of some logo lockups. All right, logo systems often include numerous elements that are to be used in particular circumstances. I would say, though, that the bigger the company, perhaps the more graphic logo variations they will have in their kind of repertoire. It's really, really, really dangerous to create branding for a company and immediately out the gate work with a bunch of different logos, because it dilutes that brand recognition business. So you want to make sure that you have a really clear and consistent presentation of the logo and the name, the word mark and the brand mark. And once that kind of has been established, then the designer does have the opportunity to maybe add more to that kind of a visual library, with really specific rules about when one might be appropriate to use versus another, or whatever, right? So here I just went and grabbed a number of different Nike ones, and we've probably seen most of these things. Nike, of course, also, as many companies do, has their tagline of "Just Do It," and in some situations, the "Just Do It" can totally stand in for Nike, right? A lot of these things work, though, because Nike is so well established. So in the very least, they've got their brand mark, They've got their combination, right, which would be this one, their word mark and their brand mark together. And then they've got these different versions. Here's their word mark, right? And then they've got the different versions of their taglines and things like that that stand for Nike. So often these sort of systems and collections get pretty big, but there's always rules for how they are to be used. And the main goal always is that brand recognition and being consistent for a viewer. One of the challenges that a designer has when they're working with branding is that they are really, really, really aware and see a lot of repetition in the design work that they do, is they're working with one client and they're working with brand guidelines and trying to visualize that company in a really consistent way, and it gets really boring for them. But for the average viewer out in the world, they're having so much less interface and interaction with that company that when they see stuff, they need that consistency because they're not seeing enough to bore them, right? They're seeing enough to just recognize it. Whereas the designer who's working with it day in and day out is often getting really bored by like, oh, I have to do the same colors again. So that's kind of one of the challenges of a designer when you're working with branding projects. Here is, I guess, Dropbox just redesigned. So here's some examples of Dropbox logo. So they have their combination logo. They have their brand mark, which is available in like an icon version as well for social media. They actually don't ever use the word mark, so it's either the combination. This is their primary logo. They also have alternate logos for when they have these sort of specific versions of their product. It's very, very, very common for lockups for a company to have a vertical and a horizontal logo version, and we call those lockups because these have to be positioned this exact way. You can't just reposition these elements together a different way with different spacing or different scales or different proportions every time you want to use a logo. They are locked up and it is only ever used that way. Super, super common though for a company to have a horizontal and a vertical version of their logos because it's very often that you might have situations where horizontal or vertical makes more sense. It's interesting here, and I got these graphics off of Dropbox's website. They do not allow any vertical orientation. So this was an example of do not do. So they only have the horizontal lockup. They do not have a vertical lockup, and you have to design around that. I also included here, which we'll talk about in the next couple slides, is good logos are designed with grids always. And so this is just, there's a lot of different ways you can use a grid. This is just a really small example. So this is really working off of a baseline grid, which is these horizontal bars. But just kind of showing how there's really careful attention spent to the spaces between the brand mark and the word mark and the proportions of each of the elements here, right? Like even these diamonds, they are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows tall. And just out of curiosity, the X is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So slightly smaller than the lowercase version of these, but all this stuff is working together so that everything is just feeling really balanced and proportioned. When it comes to designing, so a few design considerations. When it comes to designing word marks, you really want to labor over the perfect typeface. You should know by now that you can look at 20 sans serifs and they will all convey a completely different sort of sense of tone. And so you really want to labor over those. Some great ways to create a word mark is start with the perfect typeface and just adjust it a little bit. So really paying attention to kerning, which again is the space between just two pairs of letters, but also tracking and weights, combining maybe bold and light weights or something like that, or maybe even just popping part of a word or certain letters could be an interesting way to develop a word mark. You can also convert your text into outlines in Illustrator and customize it to have a visual connection with the company. So try manipulating serifs, combine letter forms, play with negative space, explore repetition, maybe make all the letters touch and see if any of the sort of interior spaces where they touch do anything interesting, kind of like FedEx. You could take out counters, so the internal shapes inside O's or other letter forms like that, and replace them with shapes that have a conceptual connection, right? There's a lot of opportunities just to sort of subtly manipulate existing letter forms. I'm always looking for a logo that's smart, that is clear, but has something more to get. Something has been manipulated in it that I might miss it the first 4 times I see the logo, but on the 5th logo, I'm going to see an interior space or some detail that really reinforces the concept, the theme, the company, the product in a really interesting and inventive way. I will have posted on Moodle, but I have a little link to a LinkedIn Learning clip that kind of talks about working with type treatments in logo design. So feel free to check that out. When it comes to designing brand marks, in terms of tips and tricks for that, like do some research. One thing that can be really, really helpful is really thinking about them in terms of the overarching shape and designing an icon or graphics that fit the shape. Those shapes play a really big role in making your graphic feel unified. So I have down here just a selection of circle-shaped logos, right? You can also choose a shape that conceptually connects with your brand. So circle tends to have feelings of community or wholeness or those type of things. Square tends to communicate sturdy, structured, organized, rigid. Triangles tend to give us a sense of motion and momentum. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can use sort of the psychology of the shape itself to relate to your company, and then come up with your interesting sort of approach to graphics that fit inside of that shape and that shape. And here we can see a few different kind of approaches to this, right? So these are all using shape, but here we've got some letter marks. Here we have got and here I guess we've got two combination marks, and here we've got a brand mark, right? So different ways that those things can be applied. Whenever you're working with logos, this is like my graphic design 3 level up comments here. Whenever you're working with logo design, like we want to make them tight and perfect and not just sort of flop stuff down in a way that like feels right. So designers are always looking for ways to provide underlying order, structure, and unity to their designs, whether they be poster compositions or logos themselves. And using grid systems and geometry are great ways to ensure that you've paid perfect attention to both positive and negative shapes and that your logo is perfectly balanced. There are a lot of resources online with ideas about how to implement grids and geometry into your logo design, and I recommend that you do some research and check them out. If you just go to like Dribbble or Behance and type in logo design, you're going to get a million behind the scenes looks at logo designs that will include these sorts of grids and approach to geometry. The idea behind it though is that you're going to set up a grid, and at the very least you can in Illustrator turn on the grid view. So if you go up to view where it says show rulers, it also says show grid, and that will at least give you these like really small increments that you can work from, but you'll see in the next few slides that there are a lot of different grids that you could create. And this is just all about repeating similar sort of building block shapes. So a lot of logos will use circles to help cut out these contours, but it's using consistent sizes. So here they're using 2 sizes of circle in this entire thing, right? And wherever there's angles, using angles that match. So it's just all about trying to be as consistent as possible. And in terms of making this, a lot of this can be made by like obviously just a circle with a stroke around it and shapes with strokes around it, but some of these things can be created by using the Pathfinder tool. So you're actually creating these circles and sort of layering up and cutting them and slicing them and dicing them. So if you're ready to sort of level up in your logo design, this is a way that I would highly recommend to do it. And I've got some examples of some designs here. So I just wanted to show you some different ways of using grids. These are all by a designer named Joreen Van Eerden from Dribbble. But he's got some really great work where he's using grids in a lot of different ways. So I wanted to choose a few that were like, here's super complex, but using a lot of diagonal lines, and then he's got a number of circles going on in there. And by the way, this is something he's going to draw out in a sketchbook first, just with his own brain, and then pick apart the geometry of this one is a little bit more complex combination of shapes, but here these two are pretty simple grids. So this one obviously is just using horizontal and vertical lines. Here we've got horizontal and vertical, and then he's just passed a few diagonals through. But these are very much things that you could set up and work within in Illustrator. Again, I don't think it's necessarily super intuitive to be working like with this in mind from the very beginning, but if you design out in your sketchbook or create like a quick and easy version of these kinds of logos in Illustrator, you can then kind of go back and set up a grid to make the final rendering of them. Or if you have a notebook that has small grid squares, this can be a more intuitive way of thinking if you are doing your sketching out in a gridded notebook. But just wanted to show you those examples. This is another project by him. I like how on this slide he's like describing the major graphic or design components of it. And again, like he's pretty smart. I didn't include the kind of thinking behind some of these branding elements. You can look up his projects if you want, but here we've got these sort of frisbee shapes that seem to make sense here. So they do all have a connection or an idea, a deeper kind of visual meaning that draws them back to their content. Here I like how this sort of cue is hidden in here into this gear. So he kind of tends to show in some of his projects how different pieces are combining together, but here again another grid that's like a little bit different. And so here just using lines and rectangles to set up this initial grid, and then these circles are created using the rotate tool, and then this would all be sort of assembled using the pathfinder tool. So all these shapes are almost stacked on top of each other, and then this big black circle would be put down underneath. All of that would be cut up using the pathfinder tool, divide, and then re-merging back together the parts that want to be merged together, and that is a real tight way to create a logo. But here he's kind of identifying the personality, the sort of concept, values, and then some of the typeface. And if you're coming up with a logo like this, definitely a lot of these forms are going to be pulled from the typeface. There's a lot of like DNA. There's already angles kind of at the end of these terminals. There's already sort of the shapes of different letter forms that you can use to kind of help bring this stuff out. So here, I guess it's not a cue, it's this sort of search element. So a mechanical gear and a magnifying glass, which is kind of cool. Here are a couple other ones. Again, I just wanted to try to grab some really different kinds of sort of underlying grid and geometry examples. So here's this one for chat robot. It's using mostly circles and then these kind of diagonal lines. Here's another one for pay me, but it's really interesting once you start looking at these behind the scenes looks. But right, see, this is the same size circle here and here, and a smaller version of it there, right? But again, kind of using the pathfinder to divide up spaces and then re-hook them back up together. Here we've got, I think, these 3 same size circles, and then 3 different size ones there. Pretty sharp. Here's another one too. It's a totally different kind of grid. And here they're describing this is kind of the white space around the outside. This is the grid elements used to kind of make that actual part. So that's pretty interesting. Which brings me to my last sort of section here. I think, I got 2 more sections. So expanded systems. So often designers will establish a primary logo. They'll often design a secondary logo and other symbols and marks that help make up the entire system. I kind of talked about this a little bit with like Nike, but maybe in a more casual sense since Nike's such a huge brand. I like these examples from this design agency called Hoodspa. Hoodspa Design is an awesome agency out of Southern California. Check out their branding systems. They work with a lot of small companies, so I like, and they tend to make what they would maybe consider more flexible branding systems where they do have a primary logo like this, but they create actually a lot of where like conventional branding says have one logo, make it be primary, make sure that that one has the most emphasis so that you build this brand recognition, and then any other sort of secondary marks used sparingly and really strategically. Hoodspa kind of throws that all out, and I think this is a more modern way of thinking about design, especially for more modern, smaller companies. Their kind of idea is not, they do have create one primary mark, but really they create a library of marks that all create like a much more rich and layered branding so that these marks can be used in combination or interchangeably or like in a variety of different ways that still create a really powerful kind of impression of what that brand is when people look at it, but isn't always delivering the exact same primary mark every time, which is really quite interesting. So I would recommend checking out quite a bit of their work. Their Instagram is awesome, and obviously their website is great too. But whenever they create a branding project, they again kind of deliver this primary, and then they create a number of these other marks that can be then used in really different ways, which is really interesting. So here's kind of my last example of that. And they're like, what is this? Is this a logo? This is too much information for a logo. They're all kind of interesting. So like, I don't even know what the primary is here. This is probably the primary logo, and then these are extra marks that can be used in a variety of different ways. It's pretty, you know, after I told you all the rules, these would be an example of people kind of breaking the rules and kind of a different kind of contemporary way of thinking about design. Okay, so once you have developed your logo and you've thought about primary logos, secondary logos, and what kinds of versions you should have available, You want to document the rules around that. So designers use and create brand guideline documents to describe the correct usage of their logos. These guidelines include information about the following. So primary logos and orientations. Are they horizontal? Are they vertical? What are those lockups? Are they both? Secondary or alternate logos and orientations. And what is an appropriate use of color logos? What is an appropriate use of black and white logos? Designers always design color and black and white. Because people need them, and they most of the time design horizontal and vertical versions as well. Brand guidelines will also talk about and demonstrate proper usage with photography and other backgrounds. They'll talk about the minimum size, because there's absolutely minimum sizes that logos should be. They'll talk about something called clear space, which means basically how much white space needs to be around the logo. We all know that white space is our best friend, and we don't like anything touching. Any design elements touching the edge or touching other design elements. We are all about margins and white space, but a lot of other people aren't. So it's really important for designers to establish, hey, there has to be a minimum of the height of the logo as white space around the logo, or whatever the rules are. Brand guidelines will also talk about generally acceptable treatments of the logo or unacceptable treatments of the logo. So I have some examples in the next few slides from Bethel University's brand manual. Feel free to download that. They have it online and you can look at anything, but we are eventually creating our own brand guidelines. So this is definitely a good example of one that you might, brand guidelines are very similar. So you will probably be looking at some examples of them and sort of modeling yours pretty closely after some of the ways that these other ones are laid out. So here's some of those examples. So they've got just an introduction. They explain their logo a little bit, talk about the combination logo, right? And then the brand mark specifically. Here they're just kind of breaking down the conceptual, kind of what this all means. Here are colors, so appropriate ways that the logo can be used in colors. So they actually offer full color. And then they offer a navy one color version, and then white and black. So it's kind of interesting to note. They do allow you to put their logo over photos, but they are showing you here how they need to be sort of in unobstructed areas of the photo. I actually kind of disagree with this one, but whatever. They're talking about logo size here. So the logo should not be reproduced at widths smaller than 2.25 inches. So that's interesting. They don't want you to use it smaller than that. They are also saying that the clear space, or the sort of margin that needs to exist always around the logo, needs to be at least the height of the B in Bethel. So talking about clear space. This is the classic brand guidelines page. They always look like this, and this is where the designer gets to have fun and do everything that anyone could possibly botch. So here are all the rules for ways that you cannot mess up this logo. There are alternate logos. There is a vertical. This surprises me. I didn't realize there was a super horizontal. They had in the past, their horizontal was Bethel University stacked. So that's kind of a new version I hadn't seen yet. But they do have a seminary logo. They have a few other sub-brand lockups. So again, this word lockup means this is how this is laid out. You can't just retype up fresh career development and calling every time. There's a file that exists, an Illustrator file that has all of the possible combinations here, and you have to only use that file. You can't retype it, right? Again, talking about minimum size. And then they've got vertical orientations too for our different departments on campus. And I think that's it. So those are some kind of brand detail things that I want to make sure that you are aware of and thinking about as you dive into the process of thinking about your own logo revision and development of your own brand guidelines.